from Main Street Art actors in between. So it's a full night of entertainment. Food is included, $25 a ticket, and all of the money goes to benefit all of the programs that Main Street Arts do.
Thank you, Marty.
That got my spiel in.
There you go.
Now
But
on
today
to
we're actually have a very serious topic. Not like it's not a typical feed topic. It's much more serious. We're going to talk about the Spanish influenza and the Spanish pandemic, the flu pandemic of 1918, right?
100 years ago.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And it was a worldwide event. And I wrote a little bit about it in the Westminster history book. Just, like, it was a smaller event here than in many places. But placing it in context, it started in March of 1918, and that was at the time when there was the German-Russian peace. There was peace on the Eastern Front, and Germany had shifted many of its divisions to the Western Front. Their plan was to drive the British into the sea and divide them from the French and win the war. And Clemenceau was frantic and saying a terrible blow was imminent. Tell your Americans to come quickly. There were some Americans there
Because that was the year America entered the war.
That was the year they were there. They had only about 4.5 miles of line, and the Western Front was nicknamed the sausage machine. I mean, which is just awful. It was like, you put live guys in, you get dead meat out, and it's like a sausage grinder. It's just like glued right there. And then in March, the Germans broke through it, and they took over 1,200 square miles of French territory, and they started shelling Paris using Big Bertha. And so the Americans, really started pouring soldiers into Europe. We sent 84,000 in March and 118,000 in April. And meanwhile, out in Kansas, there was 18 cases of this sort of odd flu, a little more severe than usual, and 3 people died. And then it spread into the army camps, and the army, the whole mobilization was just a perfect vector for the flu, because there were an unprecedented number of soldiers packed together and then being sent all over the place, and then all over the world. So it spread very rapidly at that time, but as it spread, it became much milder. And I don't, not being a medical person, I don't know I don't understand completely the mechanisms, but flu apparently, and viruses in general, they get milder or they get more severe.
Yeah.
And so this was in its getting milder phase. So it spread basically around the world in about 4 months, but as like a 3-day bug.
Right.
You were devastated for 3 days, and then most people got better. And this was at a time when our armed services had really focused on, not having more people die of illness than getting killed by the enemy.
Right.
And they had done an excellent job in a lot of respects. People were not dying of waterborne illnesses or bugs or foodborne, but there just wasn't much you could do about an air. As it today, if it's spread through the air, there isn't a lot that we can yet do to stop that. But so it was a little more deadly than usual, but and the autopsies showed the lungs looked a little unusual. But the thing that was really different about it, and I'm going to hold this up and see if the camera can pick it up, the usual curve for deaths of the flu looks like this. It's a U shape. The very young die, and the very old die, and in the middle, people usually don't die. But for this flu, it has the spike right in the middle. So the very young died, some of them died, but then it goes way down, like 10 to 19. Those kids are doing fine. Like the age group, like 19 to 40, that's where you see the real spike. and that people thought that was unusual, but this was not such a big deal, and spreads all over Europe, and it did affect the war, even in its milder form. The British had to call off an attack. The French on the western, the Germans on the Western Front got it. They called it Flanders fever, and they blamed it for, Ludendorff blamed it for the failure of his July offensive. Everybody was sick. So then so it's going around the world. It starts to come back to America, and it's not spreading. The people are coming into ports very sick, but it didn't spread into the population. People seem to have herd immunity. But what was just, from a virus's point of view, a perfect opportunity was this concentration of people in army camps on the front lines, people, concentrated and then moving, and through so many different populations where people had very different immune responses. And they're very different setups in their bodies, essentially. And somewhere out there, it mutated again. And over the summer, so it starts to explode in the end of August in three port cities. So Freetown in Sierra Leone, Brest in France, and Boston. And that's where it starts to impact us. It came back as a much more lethal disease. In Freetown, there were just death ships coming in where all the crews had it, and it killed 3% of the indigenous population of Freetown. Comes into Boston on August 27th, and there were 3 sick soldiers in this receiving area that often housed 7,000 soldiers. So 3 of those guys are sick on August 27. On August 28th, they have 8 new cases. On the 29th, they have 58 new cases. So it just explodes. It's incredibly infective, and kind of explodes exponentially. So within 2 weeks, they had 2,000 cases. And it was ghastly. I spent the last couple of days rereading these books about it, and I felt quite unwell. Because, you would go from perfect health to just being laid out flat in an hour or 2.
Yeah.
Wow.
And, with a severe lung effects, aches, fever, and the majority of people would recover in several days, but 5 or 10% got these dreadful pneumonias where, people literally were turning blue from, they couldn't, the lungs, it was almost like the interior of the lungs was burned. The cells were gone, and then they would bleed into the lungs, and they bleed, their nose bleeds, that you could tell many people would survive. The ones that were turning blue, they were not going to survive. Yeah. So these are all soldiers that we're talking about. But by the 3rd of September, there's a civilian in a Boston hospital with it. Nobody was responding as if people didn't realize how bad it was. They're still holding marches and rallies, so they have 4,000 soldiers and sailors and shipyard workers do a march in Boston the same day. It shows up at the Navy Radio School in Harvard on the 4th. On the 5th, they have this huge meeting. They pack thousands into one building for a speech and a dance, and then on the 8th of September there are the first 3 deaths. And that it also appeared at Fort Devens. Right. And at Fort Devens, it was absolutely ghastly.
I read where they were actually trying to, they didn't want people to panic, so they kept the news down.
Absolutely.
And so they were trying to raise they were trying to get people to buy bonds for the war effort.
Absolutely. So come out and do this, and do your food drives, and
don't worry about the sickness. It's going to be all right. And they actually
so
mitigate.
What I read about it was, if they said there was in this year. If they said there was brisk fighting, that meant 50% of the unit had been wiped out. So you kind of have to take what
Fake
was
news.
said by the press with a
Well, they always try to keep
fake
it,
news,
yeah, so that-
possibly. So they were
didn't
trying
want
to,
people to feel bad.
so they had a very schizophrenic reaction, even when they began to realize that it was, something's going on. Like 26 sailors have died in Boston on September 11th, September 12th, which
would be 100 years ago today.
100 years ago today, there was a draft. 13 million men nationwide are like cramming into the post office and the wherever to sign up for the draft, and it was by the 20th of September there were over 9,000 cases in the Army. They don't stop moving troops around, so they're
so they keep-
troops have to go from camp to camp, and by the 23rd there's 20,000 cases.
Could I just say something?
You could
Yeah,
say something.
You could say something.
I took a couple of trips on a troop ship across the Atlantic, so I can see how crowded it was and how it would have spread. And
Oh, and the ghastly stories of them going.
Yeah.
That they did try, as they realized how severe it was. They tried to keep the sick people from getting on the troop ships. But the thing with the flu, as we all get told every year, is you can be spreading it before you realize you have it.
even have it, yeah.
So of course they would get on the troop ships,
Mhm.
and then just incredible. Oh God.
Yeah. Well, I read another thing I read was that in trying to treat the cases, if a person had a mild case, they'd say, well, you can stay here.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have a really severe case, we're going to take you to the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And they would take them by train to the hospital, and while they were going by train to the hospital, they were spreading the more serious
The
version
worse-
of the
The worse you
the
had
worst
it,
flu.
absolutely, yeah. And then, one of the troop ship things I read is, and if you had it and you were really bad, they'd put you up on deck, which in some ways was better for you and better for everybody else. But you're up there exposed to the weather. And,
Well, wasn't that was like one of those treatments that you should
Yeah.
have fresh air would fix
Especially
you.
if you can spread
Yeah,
it.
because
Yeah.
it was
Spread
like
it
the
just a
bad
little bit
humors and
more.
the good humors.
Yeah.
and-
yeah.
Yeah.
So it was. It shows up here relatively quickly in terms of the epidemic itself, because we're so close to Massachusetts,
Yeah,
which is
yeah.
really the first place where it was bad, and I'm sure there were people who had relatives in Fort Devens and may have gone to see them when they got sick, but also where it spread in Vermont. I mean, initially it spread through transportation centers, so
Mhm.
the train comes up the Connecticut Valley. It was really bad in places like White River and Montpelier and places like that, but maybe somewhat less bad in a more rural town, but so it shows up here in late September, and then the Bellows Falls closed all its schools on October 3rd, and
Wow.
Westminster closed their schools. We had 11 cases at that time, and then people did start to die. I can only come up with a couple or three people in Westminster who died of it at that time. I know there were more that died in Bellows Falls, but by focusing on adults, adults were the ones who died. There were many children who were orphaned. Pregnant women were also particularly susceptible. And there's one story of a woman whose daughter and daughter-in-law died, and she's left with 6 small motherless children to take care of.
Wow.
There was a nurse from Westminster, Lillian Ward, who was nursing in the Army and got it in one of the Army camps and died there. So the hospital where we sit, as speaking from, the hospital was overwhelmed.
Oh, really?
The Rockingham Hospital was overwhelmed with cases, and they opened an emergency hospital in the old armory down on Westminster Street. That's now the housing was the armory at that time, and they had a hospital there, and 5 people died there in a week of it. It was people were definitely dying of it. What was in Westminster, it was the responsibility of the town health officer, and that's that's a post that I think is usually not that onerous.
Yes.
But so the
especially
town
in Westminster.
the
You would
town
think it
health
would be.
health officer was George Walker, and he had the store in the center of town that many of us knew as Shattuck's store when we were kids, and so it's people felt that he had a lot to do with Westminster coming out of it fairly well. One of the things that happened in some places around the country is that people were so afraid of it that a whole family would be down with it. There'd be nobody to take care of them, and nobody dared to come
go
in
to.
or even bring them food. And so people actually, starved, surrounded by their neighbors who were terrified, and you can well understand it. But but George Walker. So the according to the Bellows Falls Times, this is by the end of October. They say the work of health officer George H. Walker during the epidemic is worthy of praise. Insofar as he has secured assistance for families where all the members have been sick, so that they have been unable to do for themselves. In short, he has made it his business to see that none of the sick have been neglected. No doubt, the fact that so far there has been but few deaths in town because of the epidemic may be because the one in authority did his duty.
Mhm.
And that's an important thing to be remembered. And I had always thought that the flu was like a 1918 thing and it was over. And but just yesterday, Alice Cajano was looking for something else and came across some clippings about it, that it came back for a third bite later
there's
on.
supposed to be 3 lanes.
Yeah, so early 1919. And it sounds like it was actually worse in this area in early 1919 than it had been in 1918. There were, in March, there were 75 cases in Westminster, and all the schools were closed. And, it sounds like, and they must have been so weary of it at that point. But, people at the end of October, the schools opened again. Everybody thought, well, we've conquered this. But it sort of, it still had its opportunities to mutate.
Well, I think that was part of the problem of the whole thing is maybe it was because medicine was at that stage of development where they thought they really knew what they were doing, but they really didn't.
Yeah.
Well, they didn't understand the cause of it for
Yeah.
a long time. They didn't know viruses weren't well understood,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
was there. And many people died of pneumonia. You might get the kind that turned you blue in 2 days and die then, or 3 weeks later. Very often,
Right.
people thought they were better and had gone back to work. Three weeks later, they got pneumonia and died then. And so to put it in perspective, it was the most deadly epidemic that we've ever had. It killed more people in a shorter amount of time, possibly up to 100 million people
Yeah.
worldwide.
Right.
So,
How did it phase out? I mean,
and it's hard, they don't really know why it phased out. There's
That's
still
the other
studies
scary-
question.
That's
Like,
the other scary
digging
part.
up
If it
dead bodies
ex-
and looking at
yeah, if it
Yeah.
exponentially was
Right.
exploding and
Right.
everyone was getting it, it was airborne and all of this.
Right.
Like, how did it just?
Possibly people eventually got herd immunity or it stopped mutating. They don't really understand why it stopped. That's one of the things that
It's a
scares
scary-
people when flu season comes around. The
Yeah.
people that know this kind of stuff, most of us kind of block that out. But
Yeah, yeah.
in most people, those people really worry about what if that happens again. We still don't really understand why we don't have so many.
Well, that's some of
defenses
the things I've
against
read
it.
too. Is like the reporting on World War I sort of overshadowed this whole thing, but it was actually the horrendous
killed
medical emergency ever.
It
in
killed
the-
many more people than the
Yeah.
war did, actually.
Yeah.
The war killed 17 million. The flu killed possibly 100 million. The thing is, these kind of jockeying for position and which is the worst disease.
Yeah.
The perspective that I was thinking about is like, boy, when Columbus came to America, many historians believe there were more people living in the Americas than in Europe.
Mhm.
And 90% of them were dead by the
By the time
had
we
been
ever-
wiped out by
Yeah.
the mid 17th century, and so those diseases. It was of course several diseases, but those probably took 80 to 100 million lives,
Yeah.
which approximately a fifth of all humanity. and wiped out, societies totally. So I kind of think that was maybe a worse.
Yeah.
The raw numbers might
But
not
the-
be
yeah,
as bad, but so I mean.
But that, like, I get it, because that's the other thing I read was when it was people were saying there were more people killed in 24 days of the flu epidemic than 24 years of the AIDS epidemic.
Yep.
There were more people killed in a year of the flu epidemic than were in 100 years of the Black Plague.
Right, but yet
Yeah,
it
and
was
they
a
throw all these
worldwide
numbers.
epidemic, and it wasn't as like the
Yeah.
Black Plague was very concentrated.
Right.
The American, if you wipe out your whole society, I don't know. It's a silly competition in
Yeah,
some
it
ways.
is.
It's like
But
be afraid.
Yeah, it's
like-
breathtaking.
Yeah.
No one, I don't think, if you were to talk to 10 Americans, or 10 people in Bellows Falls today, that they would even know that the epidemic took place,
Right.
or what the impact
When were you
was.
brought up knowing about it, Dad? I mean, you were
No.
grew up in the closer to that era than
No,
the
I
rest
don't.
of us.
I don't ever remember hearing about that.
They call it the forgotten pandemic is the title of this book. They're like people didn't want to think about it, I guess, and you can understand
Yeah.
why.
I
Yeah.
know I had pneumonia when I was 6 years old and almost died, but I don't think I've ever said anything about flu. So.
Yeah.
Well,
Huh.
interesting connection, because I didn't know anything about it. And I teach Pilates, and every time you go to a Pilates training, or if you're teaching Pilates, you learn the history of Joseph Pilates. And he was sickly as a child, so he developed this method of, he called it the art of contrology. It's this method of training your body where there's a little bit of mind focus and muscle focus. It's a whole system. So he was interned during the First World War, and he taught his methods to his fellow internees and successfully maintained their health through the deadly influenza epidemic
Really?
of 1918.
Oh my goodness!
So I mean, I never
we should all be
like,
taking Pilates.
I never like I didn't make the connection until Mike was saying something about the flu, and I said, well, when did this happen? Was it around World War I? And I'd
Yeah.
always heard this Joseph Pilates story that he used his method to help maintain health in his ward
Wow.
during the deadly, but they didn't say what. I mean, I
I
didn't
know
know
it'd be
about this
interesting to know
deadly-
what it was he did.
Yeah.
What they focused
Well,
on.
part of what he did is because the patients were in their beds is how he developed his reformer and his Cadillac, which are two of his Pilates like machines. Is what they're called. So he attached springs to the bed so that the patients in bed could move, which probably helped them from getting pneumonia because
Yeah.
they were moving, so
Right.
and they
Yeah,
were breathing.
yeah.
And there's a lot of emphasis on breath with Pilates too, and that could have helped with the whole respiratory system. So I
yeah.
just thought that was, because you're right,
That's-
I had
that's an
nothing to
interesting
do about it.
connection.
The connection to what I do, I had to look it up in the book. So
Yeah.
Well, our beeper is
Our
going
beeper's
off.
going off, I
That's our
know.
time is up. Thank you
Okay.
so much for coming in. And as always, the time goes by too fast, and we never get to talk as much as we'd like to. But thank you guys. I want to remind everybody that episode 3 of the Cellar Hole Investigators, starring
Yeah.
Bob Haas, is coming on. It'll be showing tonight at 5 p.m. on Fact TV. I think everyone will enjoy it, and it features the Czar Bradley Law Office in Westminster. So. Thank you, Bob. And people will be lining up for autographs outside. So.
I'm sure.
All right, thank you. That's it for today, and
I got
see you
my
next
pen.
week on the feed.
That's it, folks, for the feed. Be sure to catch us every Wednesdays at 7:30 a.m. Also, find us on Facebook at Fact TV, or tell us what you think. thefeed8@gmail.com. And don't forget to watch the feed online at www.fact8.com.